Recording in progress.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour taking place this week. So we're really working you guys really hard in terms of your your attention span. I'm getting a slight echo, presumably with my own Facebook page. Can you just bear with me a second? That should be okay now. Right, okay. Today's guest is somebody that I've known of his work for many, many years, and his writings have always intrigued me and fascinated me in the sense that he's one of these researchers that really goes into great detail in terms of his research. Now, I was going to read out a little bit about the background to our guest, Malcolm Robinson, but I found that his CV was so extensive and the amount of work he's been involved in over the years is just absolutely extraordinary. So to even start to précis it would take most of the 2 hours. So I'll give him the opportunity to tell us a little bit about himself. But before we do this as well, just to let you guys know that this is going to be a bit of a wider conversation than we normally have, because also joining us today, joining Sarah and I, will be my good friend Alan Bates from the Wirral. And again, Alan has been a previous guest on this show. And the reason I was very keen to have Alan involved is Alan's own personal interests in hypnotic regression, in UFOs, in the Rendlesham case and everything. And I thought this would make a perfect 3 or 4 way discussion in terms of matters mysterious. So that's what we'll be doing. So without further ado, Malcolm, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up having this incredible career you've had in paranormal research?
Well, first and foremost, Anthony, I'd like to thank you for inviting me on your show. It's great to be part of that today. Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in the weird world of UFOs and the paranormal. Ever since I was a small boy growing up in Scotland, I just wanted to learn as much as I possibly could. And but it's fair to say that I was very, very skeptical about all these things, and I must admit to your viewers and your listeners that when I was younger, I set out to disprove these subjects. I thought there were no validity, nothing at all, UFOs nonsense, ghost poltergeist nonsense. How wrong was I? It's like anything else in life. When you get your hands dirty, I've been slapped by nothing. I've had my hair pulled by nothing. But to cut a long story short, in 1979, I formed my own society entitled Strange Phenomena Investigations. And the aims of SPI are basically to collect, research, and publish accounts relating to most aspects of strange phenomena and to purposely endeavour to try and come up with some answers to account for what at present eludes us. So it's been a wonderful journey. I've met many fantastic people, interviewed so many people, not only here in the UK, but across Europe. And it's a journey. It's a journey technically that I'm still on. It's a roller coaster journey and it's wonderful. I don't want to get off, Anthony.
So, in which case, it was quite interesting your point you said there that you started off as a skeptic. So, what I'd like you to do now is to explain to us a little bit about what was the UFO case that made you change your viewpoint on skepticism, and then follow that on with which case was it that knocked you off the fence in terms of psychic phenomena and ghosts and everything else as well.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the case that knocked me off the proverbial skeptical ufological fence, then that would undoubtedly have to be the Bob Taylor Dechmont Woods incident of 1979. It was on the back of that case, Anthony, and that's when I decided, you know what, I've got to form a group about these wonderful things. And so basically, for those who are not aware of the Dechmont Woods incident, and I'm sure there must be many that are, but for those that are not,
please.
It concerned forestry worker Robert Taylor, who was employed by the Livingston Development Corporation in the forestry department. And his job was to ensure that no cattle or sheep strayed into the woods. Very mundane job. And he had no concept, no interest in UFOs whatsoever. He was just a normal guy. He had read about it in the odd newspaper article, wee things on the TV, but he didn't study it. He had no interest in it. All that changed All that changed on the morning of November the 9th, 1979. He entered Dechmont Woods, which is near Livingston Newtown in central Scotland. Right about 10:30 in the morning, he alighted from his pickup truck and he was accompanied on the forestry ride, this just path down into the woods, by his Irish red setter dog Lara, walking down the path. And as he walks down the path, it opens up into a clearing and he stood there. He was absolutely gobsmacked by this massive dome-shaped object with a flange going around its perimeter and cross-like projections sticking up from this flange. He said the texture of the object was a wee bit like emery paper. I don't know if you know that emery paper. And he's standing there. He couldn't believe what he's looking at. And his dog was barking. Then suddenly, this solid object started to dematerialize. And you could see the young trees in the background. Then it would solidify again, then dematerialize again. And if things couldn't get any more stranger, they did. For what happened next absolutely astonished him. What resembled 2 Second World War sea mines, you know, these bobbin mines you got in the North Atlantic with the prods sticking out, you know, like that. Well, similar to that, Anthony, dropped down from this hovering craft, which is about 20 feet above the surface of the grass, impacted on the grass and started rolling across the grass towards him, making a kind of sucking or plopping noise as it pulled up the sodden earth between the rolls. Then it stopped. Then it projected these rod-like projections to his person and pulled him very, very forcibly towards this larger object. At that point, he smelled a horrible burning smell. It was all over the woods, all over the forest, this horrible penetrating burning smell. And then he lost consciousness. When he regained consciousness, Anthony, we don't know technically how long he was unconscious for. We don't know. But when he regained consciousness, the larger object was gone, the smaller objects were gone, and there were over 40 holes, triangular, circular, and ladder-like marks in the grass. He was uncoordinated. He had a pounding headache. He had a nasty graze under his chin. He had a graze on his forehead. His jersey was all muddy. His trousers were torn. And he tried to get back to his pickup truck to radio base from the handset in the cab. But he couldn't speak. He had lost his voice. And somehow he managed to reverse the truck into a small, shallow ditch. It was in the woods. And the wheels are turning in the ditch. So he couldn't get out. So he stumbled back to his home in Deans, a small village called Deans near Livingston, probably about a quarter of a mile away. And when his wife saw him, she went, "What's happened to you?" You know, his trousers and everything was all muddy and his nasty greys. He says, "I've been attacked." You've what? You've been attacked? And he says, "By what? What have you been attacked with?" And he said his immortal words, Anthony, you know, and I've got to say it and I've said it on other shows, this is what he said. He said, "I've been attacked by a spaceship thing." And his wife said, "Look, come in. There are no such things as a spaceship. I better come in." And he kept going on about this burning smell, which his wife couldn't smell. And then she says, "Christ, I know my husband. My husband would never, ever, ever make up a story like this. Wait a minute. If he said he saw this, he bloody well seen this." So she sat him down and she called the local doctor. And the local GP attended the family dwelling and he checked him over, his pulse, his rate, his heart rate, his, you know, everything. And other than being very kind of agitated with the graze, he had a graze, he was technically not too bad. But the doctor says, Gordon Adams says, "Look, I'm going to have to put you over to the local hospital just to get tested out. Would you happy to do that?" Yeah, I'll do that. So he went along to the local hospital. He waited. He waited and he waited. He waited 2 hours and nobody came near him, Anthony. So he just discharged himself from hospital. He went back and at that point, his wife had contacted Bob's boss, the forestry boss, a Mr. Malcolm Drummond. And Malcolm Drummond knew that his employee would make up a story like this. He says, let's go up to the woods. Let's show me what happened. So they went up to the woods. There you go. There's all the marks there. Oh, and lo and behold, there were all these marks in the grass. And he, like I say, he knew his worker would not be making up stories. He was 61 years of age and he was ready to take early retirement. So to cut a long story short, this was an assault. This was an assault by person or persons unknown. So they contacted the police. The police became involved. They saw the marks in the grass. They took Robert Taylor's testimony. They fenced off the area and a criminal investigation was undertaken. Now, I mentioned about Robert Taylor's trousers. They were ripped at both hips. So those trousers, which I've got in my possession, I have them here in this room. Those trousers were submitted to forensic analysis at Bathgate Police Station and also Edinburgh. And a gentleman by the name of Lester Knibb looked at the trousers and he says, Malcolm, these were ripped in a mechanical way. These were ripped in an upwards manner. These trousers were not ripped by any forest debris, i.e. sharp stones or twigs or barbed wire fencing. You could clearly see this was ripped in that type of manner. Again, cutting a long story short, in 1992, I think it was, our society decided to commemorate this wonderful event by the placement of a cairn with a brass plaque, which is still there. And a couple of years ago, I asked the West Lothian Council if they could get some signage put in Dechmont Woods, because we have signage in Rendlesham Forest. Prior to that signage in Rendlesham Forest, nobody knew where the landing site was. So we had to get it in Dechmont Woods. I fought for about 2 years and we've eventually managed to get signposts, waymarkers and a big plaque at the site. And I'm so happy because people were coming to Scotland from all over the world to see this fantastic spot, you know. So in a long way round, I've answered your question. That was the case. That was the case that took me off the skeptical fence. Because
what was it about it that took you off the fence then? What particular elements? You know, you approach this as a skeptic. So what was it about that one that made you think, no, there's more to this than meets the eye? You've touched upon other bits, but, you know, is there more?
Well, effectively, and it sounds simplified. Not only did I speak to Bob Taylor himself, I spoke to his family members, and they convinced me that he was telling the truth as he saw it. There's there's about 11 different theories to possibly explain that particular incident. So to answer your question, it was his wholehearted, his demeanour, his honesty, etc. And then obviously with the police and the forensic analysis, the holes and marks in the ground, etc. Everything came together to make this one of these Scotland's most famous cases.
Okay, and what about then the second element, paranormal case, that made you think, right, okay, that's got me into the UFO bit. But what was the paranormal?
Well, like I say, my job is to try and unmask any fraudulent mediums, find out who's trying to pull the wool over researchers' eyes. Are they trying to get a new house? Are they trying to get their name in the papers? So even though I wholeheartedly believe in life after death, and we'll cover that later on, I'm still skeptical. I still must find out, is somebody at it? Is somebody trying to pull the wool over my eyes? The case that did it for me, and I'll be here all day, so many cases, but this one case, when I lived in London, I ran meetings in London and we had some wonderful speakers, Reg Presley, we had Nick Pope, we had so many speakers come to my meetings. And a lady came at the end of the meeting, this lady approached me, she says, Malcolm, would you like to see ghosts? I says, of course, I mean, that's why I'm here. And she says, well, and we arranged for me to go to her house in Chingford, which is quite near the outskirts of London. Again, long story short, Anthony. I says, right, what's happening? She says, well, Malcolm, we've got a gentleman who's going to go into trance. He's going to go into the cabinet and strange things will happen. I says, okay, when is he coming? About half an hour from now. So I went upstairs, Anthony, to the room where this was happening. Now, the room was devoid of a lot of furniture, apart from a small chest of drawers and a long-standing wardrobe, just a singular unit with a small red ambient light in the top. In the corner of the room was a black drape going from one side of the corner of the room to the other, and behind that was a seat. That is where the medium was going to sit down, pull the cover back, and go into trance, and things would happen. I was quite excited about it all, but before he arrived, I knocked on the walls to see if there were any hidden cavities that might secrete a cassette recorder. I thumped down on the floorboards to see again if there were any maybe hidden cavities, etc. I tried to satisfy myself as best as I could that there was no instrumentation secreted to make rappings and noises. I couldn't see anything. That's not to say they were not there, but I couldn't see anything. So basically this gentleman, another part of the story, so he took us into another bedroom, and there was a small glass cabinet, a wooden cabinet with glass shelves. And on the glass cabinet, on the shelves was like rings and coins, etc. And I says, what's that? Oh, that's just apports. And apports, as we know, Anthony, is things that fall from thin air. And she said they were all labelled as well, you know. And she went on to say that when she picked them up, they were really, really hot. And I've got a story about that later on in the show. So anyway, we went back to the bedroom. And by that time, the medium was coming up the stairs. He looked a bit nervous. I padded him down to make sure he was not secreting any telescopic rods or any gizmos, any trickery. And we sat him down in this chair, and we strapped Velcro straps, and he was solid onto the chair arms. He took his shoes off, and his feet, you could see his white socks sticking out from under this black drape. On the walls of this room was little tiny silver bells, which will become apparent in a moment. Then the lady, and so there were 4 people sitting facing the corner of the room. I was one of them, sitting. And then the lady of the house put on old English songs like Roll Out the Barrel, just to get the ambience, to create this atmosphere in the room. Then she switched off the lights, and your eyes got adjusted because there was this single red ambient light on this wardrobe. So although it was dark, you could see the other people there. And then suddenly, all these little bells that were tacked onto the wall started ringing. Wow, nobody's near them. What's going on here? And then suddenly, there were all these spirit voices, male, female, young, old, coming from there, next to your ear, under your chin, under your arm, under the seat. And I'm thinking, okay. Who's throwing their voice? Because even though I believe wholeheartedly in life after death, who's throwing their voice here? And everybody was as shocked as I was, Anthony. And they're all looking like this, what? And then suddenly, and I got to tell it as it is, the God's honest truth. This face, whether it was the face of the medium, I don't think so, came molded into the very fabric of this curtain in the corner of the room and pushed out about two feet. And it molded into the cloth, and then it came back again. And at this point, the small chest of drawers, which was sitting next to this curtain in the corner, started to wobble. Now, nobody was near it. Started to wobble, and it raised itself up into the air, right up to the ceiling, I kid you not. And it free floated across the ceiling and slowly came down and fell on my toes. There were no trapdoors, there were no circus hoops or anything. Nobody was near it. Now, this voice boomed out. Was Mr. Robinson impressed by this? The spirit voice, allegedly. And I said, well, I'd be more impressed if you took it back the way. And then the voice said, we shall see what we can do. Now, and I've said this in other shows, Anthony, I made the cardinal sin. You should never, ever, ever, ever try and stop psychic phenomena from happening, because it can harm the psychic medium. We saw what happened to Helen Duncan when the police raided a seance many years ago. So what I did was maybe criminal. Am I proud of it? Well, you know, I'm a researcher. I want to get evidence yesterday. So what I did was I hooked my finger under the lip of this one of the drawers in this chest of drawers. And I said to myself, you're going nowhere. We are going nowhere. Okay, take it back. Take it away. Take it away. After about a minute, nothing happened. And I began to say, oh, this is foolish. Then suddenly there was a force. This external force was pulling it away from my finger. And I swear to God, I was trying to hold it back. I couldn't. It just rose up into the air and went back to where it came from. And at that point, a tremendous burst of cold wind pervaded the small council flat in Chingford. It was really cold. Your breath was freezing up. I was there. I saw it. Sounds a great story, but I was there. Breath was freezing up. And then it was like you were in some form of industrial freezer. You know, those freezer vans, we get big hooks and meat. That's how cold it got. Now, the only downside of this incredible event that I personally saw was that the lady of the house didn't allow us to videotape it, didn't allow us to audio tape it. And even if we did, even if I had this wonderful evidence, would that have convinced anybody? The skeptics would have said, Malcolm, great show, mate. You made that up on computer, you know. And I've said before, we're living in the Steven Spielberg age of DreamWorks laboratory, where anything can be manipulated onto computer to look like a ghost, to look like a UFO. But the same technology, when applied, can see if it's a little string, a small string hanging a UFO model from a tree. We use edge enhancement techniques. We can use color contouring. So it works both ways. So in a roundabout way, that is the one spiritual case, Anthony, that blew me away and took me off that fence. And there's so many more cases I would love to share with your good self and your listeners, Alan and Sarah, today as well.
Okay, so Sarah and Alan, would you like to maybe Sarah comment on that? Any thoughts or feelings?
Sarah.
I'm not sure yet. I just want to hear more about those sorts of things. I've never been at a seance, or I don't think I've ever encountered a spirit. So it's quite a different terrain for me, this. But obviously, you know, I was thinking about what you were saying about evidence and photographs. And I think we do live in, as Angela Lansbury says in the Bedknobs and Broomsticks, the age of non-believing. So it's hard to prove anything. The argument is always, how come we haven't got photographs of all of this stuff? But it's not necessarily going to convince anyone either way, even if there was photographic evidence, really. And then I think often in especially encounters with the spirit world, there is other kind of subtleties and sensitivities that might not transmit onto any recorded material at all.
Yeah, I think it's all coming from the Akashic field. I really do, without going into it too heavy and too deep here. But Malcolm, I had a very similar experience. I filmed a psychic medium go into a trance, and it was in my own home, and I was pretty scared. You know, I mean, I've got an open mind, but not so open that my brains are going to fall out. And this guy, he was from Manchester. And it was a very, very peculiar, and because it was in my house, there was no props, there was nothing that you know, he'd never been into my house before, and it was televised. And basically, to run through the story very quickly, he didn't need me as a hypnotist to put him into a trance. He could do it himself. I didn't even need to be there. But I use my technique as a hypnotist to relax him to the extent that he would go into hypnotized trance state, and then he would link into his own trans medium, and it was absolutely uncanny, because he was like literally less than a meter away from me, and his face distorted, his eyes rolled up, the whites of his eyes rolled right the way up, his face disjointed. He had, you know, when you've got like Pavlov's dogs that's narrating when they hear the bells. He literally had spittle coming down his cheeks, dripping down. He went ashen white, and he took on the appearance, and he was either a very, very good ventriloquist, which I don't think he was, because in fact, I can prove this. because he said he was speaking in a voice that wasn't his, that was disjointed, distorted, almost of a foreign nature. And he said he was a physician, and this was his spirit guide. And he said, these are the exact words he said, "You, young man, are going to have problems with your stomach." And at that time, I was physically fit, absolutely fine. And it wasn't until later life that I was rushed into hospital for life-saving surgery for a bowel rupture. And I'm thinking, wow, that was amazing. And he also told me a couple of personal things, which he could not have known about, which I'm not even going to open up on this podcast today. So that proves to me without any shadow of a doubt that there is stuff there going on that we don't fully understand. I put it down to the Akashic field. That's where it's coming in from, I believe.
Okay, from my point of view, I mean, one of the things that I'm always intrigued about in these cases is A, why it has to be in red light, B, why they always refuse to be filmed or recorded, C, why it has to be taking place behind a screen. Now, the skeptic in me immediately puts that all together and says, well, if it's a genuine phenomenon, why do they need all these other controls to take place? It's just putting the skeptical viewpoint on this. And also, I'm also always thinking, well, it sounds like a kind of a magical trick in some way. I'm sure it's not because you witness it. But the fact that it's almost like parlor tricks. You know, we've got communication here coming from presumably dead people or something of that nature. And it ends up being like this kind of Victorian vaudeville show.
I think that's a good point, though, Anthony. I think there is a traditional element to this, because the people that I know who are psychics often would say that they're from a generation of psychics, and that they've probably been doing the same things the same way for a long period of time. So there is a bit of a formula at work there, and they've probably learned how to do the seances in particular from parents or relatives.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I mean, if I could come in there as well, I mean, we've got to think about, I totally agree, it's a valid question, absolutely. Why do they need this, you know? But then when we look at the skull experiments, you know, they sat for many, many months in Norfolk to create psychic phenomena, and they took it over in a kind of show over to Europe as well, and the same thing happened. We've got the Franks box, we've got EVPs, we've got all this technology. I mean, the Franks box, for me, I'm not very impressed by it at all, you know.
What is the Franks box then?
Well, the Franks box is a device that's basically tuned in to some degree to all kind of radio stations, and you get wee snatches of voices coming back and forward. And allegedly through a psychic will set the ball rolling, set it up, a spirit to come through the Franks box, and somebody will ask for somebody to come through, and they'll hear a voice that's maybe reminiscent of their father or their mother, and they start to engage in kind of a conversation to a degree, but it's just little snatches, you know, just little snatches. I'm not impressed at all. I could be wrong, but I'm not. But yeah, I mean, absolutely. How do we physically prove that paranormal to any substance, to any degree, with skeptics and professors and people who's still on that skeptical side of the fence? Do we, or will we have in the near future a device, some form of device that somebody manufactures that can truly bring forward spirit? You know, we have the Spiritcom, we had this television back in the 70s that people claimed they saw their deceased relatives, and it was an offset kind of channel, they saw that coming through. I think the problem I have, not just with that, our society receive a hell of a lot of photographs claiming to be photographs of ghosts, of UFOs, and a lot of it, Anthony, is pareidolia, is simulacrum. It's the human brain is hardwired to look at faces, to look at your mother's eyes as a wee child, your nose, the face. And we see that in trees, we see it in the clouds. Oh, there's a face in the clouds. And I can't believe that people, when they send us these photographs, can't see that themselves, you know, and it's very frustrating. And I get accused of, well, I don't believe, Malcolm, why don't you believe my photograph? It's there in black and white. No, it's not, you know.
So that's interesting then. So moving on then, in terms of, let's keep the two things separate in terms of your UFO investigations and your psychic investigations. But clearly there is a linkage here, and we were discussing this with Steve Merrer on Monday as well. So there's an interesting dynamic here. But in terms of, let's come back to the UFO cases in a second. But that was the start of your work in this. Can you tell us more about some of the cases you've been involved in since then that you've thought, wow, this is extraordinary?
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned these on other shows, but again, for your viewers and listeners who are not aware of it, I had heard about UFO abductions, but I'd never ever worked on a case. Never worked on a case before. I heard about them coming from America, Venezuela, Canada, until 1992, when an astonishing case in Scotland transpired that brought me to that level to make me I just couldn't believe it. Not at first. What happened was that two men from Edinburgh, Gary Wood and Colin Wright, that again, they had no interest in UFOs whatsoever. They had heard about it like we all have. Anyway, they were taking a satellite system down to some friends in the small village of Tarbrax. And they had left Edinburgh on an August evening of 1992, travelling from Edinburgh, the built-up city of Edinburgh, all the buildings and that. And then they went out on the A70 road. The A70 road is bordered by fields on either side. You've got farmland, you've got grazing sheep, grazing cattle, and you've got Harper Rig Reservoir on your left-hand side. So they're travelling down there. And then as they were approaching a blind bend, Colin alerted Gary. Gary was driving. He went, "What the bloody hell is that?" For about 20 feet, hovering just at this blind bend, was this very black, shiny, three-tiered circular object. They knew straight away, whoa, this isn't a normal helicopter, a normal aircraft of any shape or design. They knew it's something else. They knew that. So rather than stop the car and go back, they decided to continue on their journey. So if you can imagine my hand here, that's a UFO, and this is our car. As the car was directly underneath this object, it emitted a silver shimmering curtain. Sparkling effects just fell and hit the car. And as soon as that effect hit the car, both men were enveloped in total and inky blackness. They couldn't see their hands in front of their face. They couldn't see the dashboard of the car. They couldn't see each other. Are we dead? That's what they thought. Are we dead? Then seconds later, again, we're not truly aware of how many seconds later, they regained their sight. The car was on the other side of the road. Gary was struggling with the car to bring it back onto the left-hand side of the road, and they screamed to their destination of Tarbrax. They got to Tarbrax, and Colin, who was in the passenger seat, went to unbuckle his seatbelt, and it was already unbuckled. He couldn't remember doing it. So they banged on the occupant's door who they were going to see, and nobody came out for the first minute or so until about 2 minutes later, Katrina says, "Where have you been? What time do you call this? You're an hour and a half late." The journey, Anthony, should only have been 30 minutes. They left around about 11 o'clock, just back 11, 1:45 in the morning they got there. So evidently there was a period of missing time. They proceeded to go into the occupant's house, and they said, give me a bit of paper, give me a bit of paper to draw what they saw. And then that night, and subsequent nights thereafter, they had horrible dreams of these small grey creatures, roughly about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, pear-shaped heads, black inky almond-shaped eyes, grey, bluey, translucent skin, no signs of any genitalia or anything like that was coming into their dream world. And then they found scars on their body that previously were not there. We all know our bodies. We go in the shower, we go in the bath, we know our bodies. Where did they come from? These were recent. These were red lines, etc. So Gary says, "Well, who do you tell? Do you tell the police? Do you tell your next door neighbour? Who do you go to with a story like this?" So eventually somebody had mentioned about BUFORA, which is the British UFO Research Association. And he phoned them and he phoned them and he phoned them and he phoned nobody. They never picked up the phone. Then he went to his local library in Edinburgh and he went to the paranormal section. And he found a book by Jenny Randalls, who's a very famous British authoress of UFOs and paranormal. She's my hero as well. And on the back of Jenny's book was my address. And he contacted me and he phoned me and he told me what he had seen with his friend. And I says, guys, you've got to come and sit down, come to my house. Let's do an interview. Yeah, no problem. They came to my home in Tullabuddy in Clackmannanshire in central Scotland. And I sat them down and I was just blown away by this case. Now, at that time, and this is where Alan will come in shortly, at that time, I did advocate the use of hypnotic regression as a tool to unblock the hidden subconscious mind, like a big sluice gate. Lift it up and see what comes tumbling out. And I said to both men, look, do you want to try hypnotic regression just to see if perhaps, it's a big perhaps, something else may have happened that night? Malcolm, we'll try anything. Even our wives don't believe us. Our wives, our family, our friends are giving us a hard time. They think we're crazy. Malcolm, we need to know what's going on. And if hypnosis can help it, by all means, let's try it. We used a qualified hypnotherapist. We sat them down. Now, obviously, since that time, there was a few weeks that followed, etc. So the guys would have spoke. We had used a qualified hypnotherapist. We independently regressed them back to that August evening of 1992. What you're about to hear now is the evidence from hypnosis. The conscious recall was only and forever just seeing this magical UFO hovering above the road. That was a conscious recall. Under hypnosis, they said the car was stopped on the road. Colin was taken out of the car and Gary was taken out by these small grey creatures. He was placed onto a floating stretcher, a free floating stretcher. We all know what a hospital stretcher looks like. Why? They were not holding it. And why the need for a stretcher anyway? There's certain elements as I speak through this, that I go through this, we'll come to in a moment. Why the need for it? Then they found themselves on board, presumably, this object. Gary found himself in this circular room, silver metal room. It was like a corrugated kind of ceiling with some kind of light pervading through that, a frosty light coming through that. And he was on this raised table, a flat raised table. There were no sign of any instrumentation in this room. And he was completely naked. And he was subjected to some form of medical or clinical examination. And he was so angry. He says, Malcolm, I couldn't move a muscle. I could only move my eyes. Now, I'm going to tell you a few things about what he saw on that through hypnosis. On one occasion, he remembers two small creatures standing at the foot of this bed. One of them had a kind of pendulum, a diamond-shaped orange pendulum. Started moving it across his body. And he said, Malcolm, and then he started to tell me something. Then he stopped and says, no, please, you've got to tell me. Any little thing is very important. Okay, well, tell me. He says, as you know, I couldn't move a muscle. I could only move my eyes. And when I looked to my left, I saw a naked female. She was about 18, 19, 20 years of age, completely naked. She had her knees sitting on the floor. She had her knees up under her chin. And she had her arms around her legs. She had shaggy permed hair. And she gently turned towards me. And she says, Malcolm, tears were running down her face. The despair that this girl showed was immense. He says, I'll always remember that. Then Colin found himself he found himself encased in this big glass tube. If you can imagine in your mind's eye a man's cigar tube, only it would be about 8 feet tall, glass or perspex. And he was strapped in there, he was naked. And he could see, like Gary, he could only move his eyes. He could see to the left and to the right of him, similar glass perspex objects with naked men and female in there. And there was a mist rolling about the floor. He was terrified. And then this device came up from the floor towards his head and started spinning around like this. Purpose? Who knows? Gary also saw that. When Gary was on this flat table, he saw this it was like a black lens oinks, a man's, you know, the man's black ring, the oink stone, the black stone, free floating in the ceiling. And then it was like a can-shaped device. If you can imagine a can of beans, but only that can of beans would be 3 feet tall. And it had a lever, it came up like that. It came up from the floor towards Gary's head and was making a spinning motion. Again, what was the purpose of that? Then he also said, he says, Malcolm, I know this sounds crazy, but I've got to tell it as it is. And this is all under hypnosis, Alan, as well. He says, suddenly I saw, it was like a pool of a liquid gel, a man's liquid shaving gel, just bubbling up from the floor of this object. And coming out of it was a small grey creature. Now, we did all these drawings as well. And I says, Gary, you've drawn what looks like ribs on this creature, because normally the greys are just a plain body. Is that ribs? He says, you know what? He says, I think it's heavy folds of skin. He never said ribs. I think it's heavy folds of skin. And there's so much more to this case, you know, it's a massive case. Now, as I said, I've took a lot of stick from fellow researchers who said it's all nonsense, that hypnosis should never be used on a case like this. I was in the newspaper about a few weeks ago, Anthony. There was a case in the Scottish Daily Record where there was a robbery in Glasgow, and they get away on a motorbike. And they said to this old lady who was standing there, you didn't happen to get the number plate of that motorbike, did you? Well, I don't know. They used hypnosis. She got it straight away. Bang, straight away.
I've done exactly the same thing, Malcolm. There was a bank robbery in my town about 25 years ago, and the police called me in, and we got evidence and it was front page newspaper with my face on, and I thought, no, I don't want this. And they caught them on the evidence under hypnosis that the bank tellers didn't get at the time with the fingerprints, because one of the bank robbers took one of the gloves off to get into a cupboard up here, and she couldn't recall that. But under hypnosis, she said he took his glove off to get into that cupboard. Now, you know, they were in that much trauma that, you know, she couldn't recall that, but under hypnosis, she did. And that led to the conviction of these bank robbers. And consequently, my face was put on the local newspapers. No, I didn't ask for this, not this bit.
I mean, there you go, Alan. I mean, hypnosis does have its uses, and unquestionably. But then we could say that people have said to me, they said, well, Malcolm, okay, we're aware of the stuff that's came out under hypnosis, but couldn't that be kryptonesia? Now, kryptonesia, as you're probably well aware, Alan, you know that this is something you may have read a book about UFOs when you're a small boy or a small girl, whatever, you've read it, and it's went right back into the recess of your mind. You forgot about it. But somehow under hypnosis, when somebody's asking about UFOs, this filters back. It's not a true story. It's something you've read as a child. And the same applies about hypnotic regression on past lives. Could it not just be a genetic inherent memory? So when the hypnotist, and I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this, Alan, in a moment. So when the hypnotist takes you back to a seafaring captain of the 15th or 16th century, you're coming away with a wonderful story. It may not be kryptonesia, it may not be something you've read in a book, but it could be genetic. So your great grandfather.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, and I've written books on it.
And Alan and I have discussed this many times, haven't we, as well?
Many times with
genetic memory
hypnotic regression.
Please, Alan, just go on slightly on that.
Yeah. I mean, when I've done the live demonstrations of past life regression, I encourage people in the audience to Google real time. So if I've got a subject deeply hypnotized, and we take him back to the First World War, and he's shaking, which I've had in the past, literally shaking, and he describes where he is, what he's doing, his name, his regiment, who's with him in the trench, who's just died. And meanwhile, the audience are Googling this in real time and say, yeah, Sergeant Jeffries was there. He did die on that day. And this guy is literally shaking with cold and fear, the PTSD. I mean, I've had so many cases of regression that, you see, I'm not just looking for a date, a time, a name. It's got to be proved to me. It's got to be proved. Now, the mind with false memory syndrome, the mind has the ability to go so far with the jigsaw, and then if it comes stuck at a certain point, the mind can actually fill that jigsaw piece with false information. So that's what you've got to be careful of as well with regression.
But having said that, I still tend to believe in reincarnation. Dr. Ian Stevenson was a great advocate of that. The cases coming from India, etc. The small boy saying to his mother, "You're not my mother. My mother, true mother, lives about 15 miles down the dusty road," and it later transpired that that was the case. And Jenny Kruko, Yesterday's Children, the book about the Irish family and that. So there clearly is still something to be debated there. And I think, because I believe in life after death, it goes without saying that there must be this reincarnation that you make your own parents. You can go to any country in the world and you want to be there. But it's a very controversial topic for sure.
I think the major issue, I mean, Ian Stevenson's cases were very interesting, but I've seen analysis of Ian Stevens' cases, and it is fascinating to note the number of cases, particularly in India, where you almost consistently have lower caste people claiming to be reincarnations of higher caste people. You very rarely get the case of a higher caste person claiming to be the reincarnation of a lower caste person, because of course it is not of any pecuniary advantage to do so. So we have to take this slightly carefully. I'm not, and I have, I know people who knew Ian Stevenson, and he was very keen to believe, this was something he'd invested a great deal of his time and his life in. But again, I wrote a book with Irvin Laszlo about this a few years ago. And, some of the cases I came across in Ian Stevenson's cases were quite extraordinary, and you cannot, but if, as Alan pointed out there before, we could argue that it is the zero, it's a kind of a memory field that we can all tune into under certain circumstances. But one of the cases that intrigued me in my own research was the Chowchilla case, whereby a group of children, they made a movie into it as well, not about the particular memory thing. They made a movie about the Chowchilla case, and it was a group of children who were abducted in California in the 1970s. And the children were abducted, and actually they buried the bus, as I recall, and kept the children buried inside the bus. But what they did was they hypnotized the bus driver, because the bus driver managed to escape, and the police got him, and they brought in somebody like Alan, and they regressed him back to the incident where the car came in front of the bus to stop it. And the hypnotist turned around to him and said, "Can you read the number plate?" And the bus driver read the number plate in this hypnotic regression state, and this is how they traced it. So clearly there is something very powerful here, and I think
the power is amazing. Going back about 18 months ago in Europe, my clinic in Europe, I had a little old lady who was suffering with dementia, and she had misplaced 4,000 euros somewhere in the house, and she thought it was a housemaid, a housekeeper, that had stolen it. Now, to prove this, she needed to find the money, and I used regression with her. And I took her back to when she came into the house with the envelope with the 4,000 euros. And she had actually hidden it in a compartment in one of the rooms on the left-hand side in the bottom of the wardrobe. And afterwards, we found out that she found that. And obviously, that exonerated the case with the housekeeper. And she was absolutely delighted. Because once you lose money in a house, you're going to suspect somebody, and it's, you can lose relationships, friendships, employment, and everything. And that 4,000 euros was found using hypnosis. So very powerful tool.
And of course, the idea, isn't it, if we talk about cryptomnesia here, with the point Malcolm was making, that effectively, as I understand it, under light hypnotic states of mental states, you're very much in control of the hypnotist, and sometimes people subliminally want to come across well, and they could arguably bring about information from things they have read, some things they've experienced, and confabulate a whole storyline involved in this. But clearly there's, as I think, Malcolm, the most powerful comment you've made so far, of a lot of powerful comments, was just the idea that just because you can explain something by reproducing it, like, with sounds and magic, you can reproduce something that's weird and wonderful. It doesn't discredit the thing in the first place, because it doesn't. You know, there could be reasons why you could reproduce these things, but it doesn't mean that they may not be past life memories. So I think we really need to be much more circumspect before we dismiss these things with our exact explanations, I think. Sarah, have you any thoughts on this? Again.
Well, I was just thinking about what you were saying there about this idea of the Akashic field or 0 point field, whatever you want to call it. And Steve Merrill was saying really the same kind of thing when we spoke to him on Monday, because he was saying that he thinks all of this stuff comes from the same source, but kind of has different faces that it puts on. And depending perhaps on somebody's cultural programming, it's going to come through in a certain representation, like you say. I mean, I think that it's hugely underestimated how we're influenced by media, film, TV, adverts. I can trace back themes that appear in my dreams to being a small child seeing adverts on TV. And so I actually think these things do have a massive influence on us, but obviously there are higher powers at work, and they're just filtering through our own cultural conditioning, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And on that, moving on, so we've talked about the UFO investigations. Now about your ghostly your ghostly investigations. I'm really interested now to move on to those.
Yes, I mean, obviously, I've put myself in the ballpark simply because of my love and my desire to try and get answers to account for these many, many mysteries. And I'll just take you through 2 or 3 that I've enjoyed dealing with over the years. And one of them was actually when I stayed in Hastings. And not so long ago there was a lady who came to my meetings in the Cinque Ports pub. That's in All Saints Street in Hastings. We had monthly meetings there. And she says, Malcolm, there's one of the leading surgeons off at the local hospital. He's off his work. And I went, well, I mean, it's a stressful job, you know. Oh, no, you don't understand. This was at the Conquest Hospital in Hastings. He's off. Well, tell me the story. What happened? She says, well, he was walking down the corridor at the Conquest Hospital and he saw an elderly gentleman standing and he went, are you okay? You all right? I think so. And then his beeper, the doctor's beeper went off. He says, excuse me a moment, sir. He checked his pager and he was wanted in the resus room. I think you know where I'm going with this story, but there is a twist. And he turned around to the elderly man and he wasn't there, but he presumed he had went through some swing doors, which was there. So anyway, the doctor went to the resus room and he saw a man on the bed with the paddles on his chest, pulling him back to life. And you guessed it, it was the man he saw in the corridor. So here's the twist. What happened then was they went to the CCTV cameras and they rewound it and they could see the doctor walking down the corridor. He stopped and he's talking to nothing, nobody at all. Again, this is an educated man, an educated doctor. Do we believe the testimony? Do we believe the testimony of the CCTV footage? What kind of evidence is going to convince Joe Skeptic, you know? And in another case, we were working some years ago. We were working in a house in Tullabody, yes, Tullabody, small village in Clackmannanshire. This lady came to our society saying that she's getting things falling off the walls, cold spots, she's been getting nipped by nothing. Could we help? So we went along and we always take a psychic medium. And I mean, I'm psychic as a brick, Anthony, you know, I've had things happen, but we took this psychic medium and sometimes we'll watch her very closely. And if she walks into the house, she may go, I mean, oh, nothing's there, or she might go, oh yes. And that was one of the cases. Her head was going like that. So we went up to one of the bedrooms where all this activity was happening. And we did switch off the lights. It was semi-dark. And the lady says, Malcolm, ask spirit. Oh no, she said, do you feel spirit here tonight, Malcolm? I went, no, nothing at all. You're joking. It's here in abundance. You're telling me you can't feel nothing, Malcolm? No. Okay. Stand over to the corner of the room and extend your arm and ask spirit to touch you. Now, I made sure that everybody was at the other side of the room, Anthony. All my fellow researchers, nobody was near me. I put my arm out into the middle of the room. Right. Anybody from spirit side, kindly touch the back of my hand. 1 minute went by, nothing. 2 minutes went by, nothing. Oh, this is suddenly this tremendous force pushed down on my hand, and it was like one of those Bavarian beer keller guys, you know, with them slapping their thighs, and it really slapped my thigh. And I've often said in my lectures and that, I says, perhaps it's maybe some of the best ghost equipment a Ghostbuster should have is bicycle clips. Think about it. Then on another occasion, we were dealing with a haunted house in Stirling. And again, same thing, same scenario, cold spots, things moving about, you know, displacement of objects, etc. And we were sitting there with all the equipment in the room, and nothing was happening. And then I said to myself, I questioned myself, why do I do this? I mean, nothing's happening. And 9 times out of 10, when we go on a ghostly investigation, nothing happens. So nothing's happening. Why do I do this? Bang. Suddenly the whole room illuminated by thousands and thousands of tiny pinpricks of white light, magical lights. It was like a children's November the 5th handheld sparkler that the kids do on November the 5th. It was all over the ceiling, all over the walls, all over the carpet, all over your bed, all over your person. And I said to the psychic, what's this? What is this? And she calmly said, Malcolm, come on, that's pure psychic energy. I went, I love it, you know, and it only lasted about maybe 15, 20 seconds. And it was like a dimmer switch in the wall where you dim the lights. It suddenly went into darkness again. So with fingers crossed, we went to the VCR equipment. It was pre-digital at the time, just before it came in. Press stopped, press rewind, and press play. Come on, you've got to have captured this. Nothing, a blank screen. So again, even if we had captured that, Anthony, you know, the skeptics would have said, well, you made it up, you've done something on computer or something. And I think evidence for the paranormal, be it ufological, be it cryptozoology or ghost poltergeist, sometimes comes from the person themselves. Because you know in your own self that you saw what you saw. Some of the questions we have to ask witnesses are, well, some might say they're controversial and they don't go down very well. And the reason we'll say to Mrs. Jones, you on any medication, Mrs. Jones? Why? What are you asking me that for? Because we want to see perhaps if she's hallucinating, Anthony. You know, we're going to ask all these questions, etc. I remember once we were dealing with a ghost case. So, are you interested in ghosts and poltergeists, Mrs. Smith? No, me, son, not me. Behind her, Anthony, was a bookshelf with lots of ghost books. So you've got to be observant, you know, you've got to keep your mind's eye. And I mean, last year I brought out a book on the Sauchie poltergeist, so Scotland's biggest poltergeist case. I gave a talk a few Saturdays ago here in my hometown of Sauchie, sold out. There were over 150 people in the hall, and they were trying to bring in more chairs. They ran out of chairs. The story on that one is that, and it was before my time, but I did do re-investigations of it in 1987, 1989, and 2020. The story on that one is 11-year-old Virginia Campbell. She lived with her family in the small village of Moville in County Donegal in Ireland. And in 1960, they came over to Scotland. She didn't want to go. Her school was there, her wee dog Toby was there. She didn't want to leave Ireland, but they came to Scotland. So that was fine. And then suddenly, a few weeks after being in Scotland, strange knockings and rappings started to happen in the family home. She shared a bed with her cousin at the time, and they heard footsteps walking along the linoleum floor. Nobody was there. Bangings on the headboard, scratching noises. Nobody was there. So they ran down the stairs into the living room. And as they ran down the stairs, these 2 young girls, it was like the sound of a medicine ball, a big heavy medicine ball that you got in the 1960s. Thump, thump, thump down every step. They ran into the living room and they said to their parents, now, something strange happening here in the room, you know. But the parents obviously thought that their kids were just making it up. Come back to bed, put them back to bed. And then the parents themselves heard the knockings and bangings and rappings. It got so bad that they had to get the local minister, the Reverend Lund, who, now this is a man of the cloth. He attended the family home. he saw it as well. He saw the knockings and bangings. They heard the footsteps. They also got a couple of doctors in, and the doctor says, Malcolm, you could see the bed covers rippling. And Virginia had her arms out of the bed, and the covers was rippling like that. It was like as if you had a stone and you threw it in a quiet mill pond, the concentric ripples bound like that. And he also said that strange writing appeared in her face, and she spoke in some strange language. And then this long linen chest, back in 1960 in Scotland, and I dare say England, at the foot of your bed, you had this big long linen chest that contained duvets, it contained throws, pillows. It was against the wall. Whoop. It came out 18 inches across from the wall of its own accord, screeching across the linoleum. And then the lid of this this chest of the, let me get this right. The lid of this unit started flapping up and down as if two imaginary people were going like that. And if things couldn't get any worse, they did. Followed her to school. Back in 1960, in the class rooms of Scotland, you had about 30, 40 kids. And on this occasion, the teacher had given the class, the boys and girls, an essay to do. So as the teacher looked up to the class, all the heads were down, they were all writing away, apart from one little girl, Virginia Campbell. Virginia had her forearms on the desk like that, and the teacher roared up, Virginia, what are you doing? Stop that at once, stop it. Okay, miss. And she lifted her forearms, and the desk lid was flapping up and down. Nobody was near it, flapping up and down. There was an empty desk next to her. It rose up 2 or 3 inches and clattered back down again. Now, on another occasion, if that wasn't bad enough, it's all in my book. There's a wee plug, Socky Poltergeist. If that wasn't bad enough, Virginia went to the teacher with a jotter, and with her work, and popped it down on the teacher's desk. Now, back in 1960, the teacher's desk was a big, heavy wooden thing. There was a cane lying flat on the teacher's desk. It started to vibrate, and it started to stand up on end and thump, thump, thump down on the desk, and it fell off the desk. Now this sounds crazy, but I interviewed the teacher, and she says, Malcolm, I didn't even know what a poltergeist was. I'd never even heard the terminology. But at that point, my desk rose up several centimeters from the floor and started moving around 90 degrees. Whereas my stomach was in the long part of the desk, it's now in the short part of the desk. At that point, as you can imagine, the class was in an uproar. All the kids were screaming. And so the teacher says, okay, I'm going to take these all out into the schoolyard. The teacher went to the door to open the door. She says, Malcolm, I couldn't open the door. This is what she told me over the phone. I couldn't open the door. Oh, it must be very windy today. She says, Malcolm, it was like a big, heavy man was at the other side of this door. And he says, you're not coming out. And then suddenly it released. And it was like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. All these kids tumbling down, trying to get through this door, On other occasions when the doctors and ministers were there, they attended the family house, and the pillow underneath Virginia's head turned round 90 degrees. The pillow next to Virginia, nobody was sleeping beside her at that time, depressed down like a secondary invisible head was molding into the very fabric of that pillow. And I've interviewed a number of the classmates of Virginia Campbell, and boy, they were terrified. They saw some incredible stuff, and today it stands the test of time as probably one of Scotland's biggest poltergeist events. People have said to me, well, Malcolm, what caused it? And what I personally believe what didn't cause it was this. People say that it's this sexual energy that comes out of young kids, this pubescent sexual energy that comes out of children and moves ornaments and moves furniture. What a load of nonsense, because if that was the case, we'd have poltergeists in every single council house in Great Britain. With the state of the kids today, they're all, crazy. Well, not them all, but they're all in the upset, So I don't think it was that. I honestly think it was some form of bad spirit had attached itself to her, because not only when it happened in Socky, they went, what can we do? Okay, let's move her to a smaller town called Dollar. It's a small town about a couple of miles away from Socky. Let's take her to Dollar. They took her to Dollar. The same things happened, all these knockings and rappings and bangings. So I tried to track her down last year when I was writing the book. Where is she went to? So I approached the newspapers in Donegal. Didn't get any leads there. Then I found out that she was in Bedford, in England, in Bedfordshire. And then a lady, an 84-year-old lady, phoned me up when I put something in the Bedfordshire News. And she says, is it Virginia Campbell you're looking for? And she, to cut a long story short, it was the girl. She knew her, but she doesn't know where she's went to now. She's moved to a small town next to Bedford. And so we know that she's there, but we don't know exactly where she is at the moment. But what a case that was, incredible.
That sounds absolutely extraordinary. And one of the things that really intrigues me here is poltergeist activity and what is taking place in poltergeist activity. And that moves us on very, very perfectly to, my final question to you before we move on to another subject, which will bring Alan and Sarah in, which is, well, what are the links? Do you think there are links between UFO activity, poltergeist activity, ghost activity? Do you think there is a background something that is that involves them all?
I'm still trying to fashion out an answer to that. I mean, the way I believe in the paranormal these days, it's all dimensions. I go along with a lot of what Jacques Vallée said, the superstring theory, quarks, neutrinos. We're dealing with a new science that we're not fully comprehending here. We're trying to get a step on that first ladder of understanding. But as far as an overlay, to answer your question, Anthony, the only case that I've ever dealt with that happened in Devon, in England, in 1998. And initially, we were there to deal with a lady who it was a haunted house. She was seeing, like, you ever watched that program, Little House on the Prairie, with all the little girls in the pinafore dresses on? She says she was seeing these little girls, these ghostly girls, in her bedroom. Then she started to say something else to me, and then she stopped. I went, no, keep telling, talk to me. You won't believe it if I tell you, Malcolm. No, talk to me. Okay. I saw this little girl in a pinafore dress at the right-hand side of my bed. And at the end of the bed, against the wall, was a small grey being. What on earth is a small grey being doing in this room with this ghostly girl? As an overlap, that's the only time I've ever encountered something of that nature. Maybe that's in some book somewhere, it's something similar, but I've never encountered anything until that time. And it makes me wonder what was going on there, because she hadn't seen any UFOs. There were no UFO activity in the neighborhood. But here we have a ghost and an alien. Sounds incredible, but I got to say it to you, Anthony. That's what she said, yeah.
I think that's extraordinarily interesting because you probably, if you're aware of my last book, I have a whole section. Was the book before? No, it was the last book where I have a section on my book, my mother's experience with a grey. And again, this imagery of the greys goes right back into history, and I'm very much somebody who supports the Jacques Vallée approach to this, that the phenomenon is much more complex than we lead ourselves to believe. And indeed, when we had the show with Steve Merrer a couple of days ago, this was exactly the approach we were taking, was that we can't box it. If we start boxing it into certain areas, we will go down the wrong route. And also the phenomena seems to play with us. It's again, the whole concept of the Joe Fisher hungry ghosts, the idea that he's manipulating us, and it is somehow almost joking with us. It's playing with us in some way to see how our reactions will be. And I think this is an area that collectively we, as in the collective people who've been involved in these interviews that we've done on INCON over the last few years, really, is that I think that collectively, if we put all our heads together, I'm sure that we could come down to some kind of at least idea of what is taking place. And again, you know, from my point of view, I very much take the actual quantum physics approach, but I mean the real genuine quantum physics. I don't mean the new age interpretation of quantum physics. I mean the quantum physics of quantum physicists and how what that is telling us about reality. But moving on now, what I would like to do now is for the last, what, 3/4 of an hour or something, is an area that's long fascinated me ever since the very early 1980s, when I became very interested in the Rendlesham case, purely and simply because I subsequently lived in that area quite close by. I lived in Colchester, but it was quite comparatively nearby to the Ipswich area. And I know the area around Rendlesham extremely well because of knowing the area and having relatives in that area. And I'm intrigued because Alan, will now bring Alan in, because Alan has been involved in a fascinating project and also a documentary on Rendlesham. And I'd like Alan to tell us a little bit about this, because we didn't get the opportunity to talk about this when we last interviewed Alan. And then bring Malcolm in terms of his experiences of UFOs, and bring Sarah in as well, to just and myself to just have a really just interesting, let's dig deeper into this. Because I noticed, for instance, you mentioned Nick Pope, and I know that Alan was involved with Nick Pope within this exercise. But also, the other point that we can't forget here as well is the use of hypnotic regression under these circumstances as well, and this kind of thing. So Alan, would you like to explain a little bit about the project you were involved in and what you discovered?
Yeah, sure, with pleasure, Tony. Yeah, but before we do, just very quickly, if I could just backtrack, rewind to Malcolm's case, where the chaps were abducted and they said that they couldn't move, they could only move their eyes. Now that brings into play sleep paralysis. Now I've experienced sleep paralysis on 4 occasions, and I've also interviewed people who've had sleep paralysis for one of my books. And that sounds very, very similar, where as much as you try, you're in terrible fear, but there's a pressure, there's a weight on you, and you can't actually move your body. It's only your eyes can see. Now, whether that links in with extraterrestrials and other things as well, there's definitely something that we don't know going on there. And before I just go into the Rendlesham, I'd just like to tell you a very quick story, if I may, of a lady I interviewed for my last book, UFOs, It's Time to Wake Up, was in Connors Quay, North Wales. Now, I know this to be factual because my hairdresser, his husband's mother, going back 45 years ago, she's a teetotaler. She's a church warden. She's not into hairy furry stuff. And it was in the summertime, about 45 years ago, she got up to use the outside toilet. It was in the summer. It was a warm morning. It was bright, very quiet, very still. And when she went down to use the outside toilet, she heard like a rustling in what she thought was rats or foxes around the bin cupboard area. So she went down to have a look. And as she opened the door, there was a grey alien in the bin, one hand on the bin lid. And they looked at each other, fixed gaze, for literally, it seemed ages, but it was probably about 5 seconds. Then it dropped the bin lid and it took off. And it was not supposed to be found. And as she said that it moved almost like a chimp. And she said, it sounds crazy, but it had like a grey suit on, like a grey space suit on, the greys. And she described it as we would describe a grey. And as it took off, it almost chimp-like. It run and then disappeared. And she said she didn't feel frightened, and she went back to bed. And she said she felt really calm about it. And the next day, she wanted to tell her husband Pete, but couldn't, because she thought he would ridicule her, and and she couldn't handle him ridiculing her. So she let it go. And then she was going to tell him that week, but there was in that week in the local Chester newspapers, there was a report of nurses going on the morning shift who claimed that they saw a UFO and aliens on a bridge near Chester. So the husband's reading the newspaper and he said, look at these girls, these nurses on the way to work, they've seen an alien. And he started saying, they must have been to a good party, they're going straight into work, they must be drunk. So she didn't tell him the story. And it wasn't until he died 2.5 years ago that she said, she called in the family and she said, I've got a confession and something to tell you now. Your father's died. And they all thought, what, skeletons in the closet? What's this about? And then she explained what she saw. And she is even now in her 80s, late 80s, she's of sound mind. And she knows what she saw 45 years ago, but couldn't tell her husband out of fear of ridicule. And now he's passed away. And the kids were made up, you know, they were, wow, an alien visited our toilet, our outside toilet, you know, but, you know, and to interview this lady and to interview the family, it was just 100, you know, I'm not a gambling man, but I would put a bet on that. That was absolutely true. Onto the Rendlesham story. Make this as quick as I can because there's so much we could go on for hours, couldn't we, guys?
I know.
Going back to, actually, I said before to Tony, before we came on air, we were talking about space-time and linear time. I lose myself in time. This actual project, go with Nick Pope, Colonel Holt from the US Air Force, and other people I'll get onto in a minute, was actually in 2010. It was the 30th anniversary of Rendlesham Forest. Now, for the viewers and the listeners today, you know, I'm pretty sure they would have, the very nature of the interest that's drawn us into this, they will know of the Rendlesham Forest case. But for the people that don't, I'm sure you've heard of Roswell. Well, this was England's biggest UFO, without any shadow of a doubt. And on the 30th anniversary, a month before, I was contacted by Paul Wookey, who is a paranormal investigator and filmmaker. And he said, we've got elements of this with regression that we'd like you to be on board. So we all met in London. There was Nick Pope, who I met for the first time in London in the pub. And Nick likes a beer, I can tell you. So anyway, there was a lady called Christine Hamlet Walsh, who's a psychic medium, quite well known in America as well. Emily Booth, who was a paranormal investigator. And they flew in, especially for this filming, Colonel Charles Holt, who was the deputy base commander when all of this happened in 1980. So I didn't know too much. I've heard of Rendlesham, but I didn't know too much about it. So on the anniversary, the actual 30th anniversary, 2 o'clock in the morning, we all went into Rendlesham Forest with the TV camera crew, and we sat down exactly where did this happen. And Charles Holt explained, went through everything. Don't have the time to talk about the story now, because we could talk all day, all night about it. But, you know, for UFO investigators and people into the paranormal, for me to be sitting with Nick Pope, ex-Minister of Defence, and Charles Holt, it was it was a dream come true for any investigator. So anyway, so we did that. And what I would like to point out, which is I think is quite important and very relevant to what I'm talking about, is the night in question, 30 years anniversary, it was a crystal clear night. Absolutely no light pollution, nothing. And the theory that some stupid theory that somebody's put forward, the Orford Ness Lighthouse, absolute trollop. I was there, 30 years anniversary, looking at the Orford Ness Lighthouse, which is so many miles away, and it is a blip.
Yeah.
Why would the military police, why would the British police be involved? Why would the British and the American governments be involved if it was a little blip of a lighthouse? Absolute tosh. I was there, I saw it. So if any of you listeners now, you can remove that Orford Ness Lighthouse completely out of the equation. So I do believe that stuff went on that over those 3 days. Charles Holt, very credible witness. He was, and Nick Holt are both signing the official Secret Acts. There's only so much they can say. I tried to get off record regarding the nuclear weapons stored at Rendlesham Forest. And Charles Holt looked at me and he says, I cannot deny, and I cannot, you know, the way the Americans swing it. He wasn't giving anything away because obviously he's tied to American secrets as well, especially affiliated to nuclear weapons. But basically what my feelings are, yes, there were nuclear weapons being housed in Rendlesham Forest, and on the American Air Base. And so my input was the next day, there are local people who claim to be abducted by aliens, in that area in Rendlesham Forest. So there was a lady called Brenda, and we went round to her home and had a chat with her before. We filmed her, and it was really uncanny because it brought back memories of when I regressed the trans medium. Well, sorry, when I hypnotized the trans medium, because she started talking in a disassociated flow of words and mannerisms. So it was like she was having, it was like a split personality. I was asking her questions. Can I communicate with, the host? She was the host, but can I communicate to the alien via this lady called Brenda? And it was affirmative. So with all the questions were asked, and she said there are various species visiting the Earth. And most of them are peaceful, which is always nice to know. But there are some who are not so peaceful, with different agendas. And I asked this alien, using the host under deep hypnosis, and once again, her lips were not moving. This disassociated voice was coming from this lady, and you could tell, it wasn't her. And when I asked permission to use her as the host, the alien said yes for a certain time limit only. And anyway, I asked the question, this craft and these lights that were observed in Rendlesham Forest in 1980, were they extraterrestrial? And came back affirmative, and it was this species. So it was absolutely fascinating. Now, this lady, if you could see her actually, the voice change that was coming from her, it was absolutely fascinating. It really was. So I hope it opens a whole new paradigm, really, doesn't it, of what we can do with the power of the mind.
Malcolm, what's your take on Rendlesham then? Have you been involved or in any shape or form?
Well, like most people, I'm well aware of what happened in Rendlesham Forest back in the winter of 1980 over the 3 nights. And I could be here all day speaking about that. Some people think it, with all the secrecy and all the rigmarole, maybe it was a Russian satellite that came down into the woods and they had to retrieve it. But we don't know for sure about that. A number of people claim to have seen this strange diamond-shaped object, throwing out colours and some type of hieroglyphics or wording on the very edge of this craft as well. So I'm not poo-pooing any of the witnesses who saw or claimed to have seen that particular object. I've had a number of sky watches in Rendlesham Forest with the help of Brenda Butler, a lovely lady. And we've been there many, many times, and although I've not personally seen anything myself, it's just an incredible place to be. There's no denying when you look at this jigsaw of people who have been involved in it. And like Alan said there's evidence of UFO abductions out with or near that area. There are other people who have claimed to have seen strange craft flying in the skies around Rendlesham Forest as well. And I've heard so many strange tales of people seeing small greys. One of my dear friends, a lovely guy from York called Alien Bill, claimed to have seen these small greys in Rendlesham Forest as well. So clearly there's something operating there. Is it a focal point? Is it a UFO hotspot? Is it a window area? We have these window areas in Gulf Breeze and Pensacola, and the Pennines in Yorkshire, Bonnybridge in Stirlingshire. And if so, why? Why do we have these locales, these areas where these mysterious events transpire? We can only speculate, but Rendlesham for sure is indeed the British Roswell. Absolutely, I'll second that, Alan. And it was fascinating what Alan had to say there about this lady and this alien coming through her and directing answers to the questions. So what a mysterious world we live in. Don't we just love it, folks?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that Alan and I have discussed for many years is trying to pull some of this together and using his skills as a hypnotist to really dig in deeper into all this, because it clearly there's a linkage here between human consciousness and something else that can either manipulate human consciousness or can powerfully see things we can't. And I'll give an example of this again in my book with Irvin Laszlo. I cited the case of a guy called Indrida Indridason, and I was citing the work of Professor Erlander Haraldsson, the late great Erlander Haraldsson, who was professor of psychology at the University of Iceland. And how the storyline goes is that I think it was around about in 1905, something like this. There was a circle of people involved around the medium Indrida Indridason. And every Friday night, I think it was, they would get together and Indrida Indridason would go into a trance state and he would channel people and people would come and dead people would come through him or whatever. But he had this most peculiar drop-in take place. Now, a drop-in is something that is known in mediumistic circles as being the medium will be channeling something and then suddenly something else will take over, as if there's a communication channel opens suddenly. And the communication channel opened and it was this person. And this person comes in and he's describing and he turns around and he says, it's on fire. The house is on fire across the road from me. I'm in Copenhagen. I'm in Königstrasse in the centre of Copenhagen. And there's a fire across the road. And the fire crews are turning up. And they're all listening to this. It's like a radio station, a person's radio station. Suddenly some of the signal comes in. And they're going, and the voice turns around and says, yes, and he described his name. He said, I think his name was Larson or something. And he said, I'll come back to you because there's something happening now. I'll come back at 11 o'clock. And he cut off. And then they're all sitting there going, oh, right, okay. So now it is important to be aware, in those days, Iceland was part of the Danish Empire, and it's part of Denmark. But of course, there were no communications in those days. So the only communication was by steamer coming from Copenhagen to Reykjavik. Okay. So 11 o'clock comes by and the voice comes back in again. And he's saying, oh, yes, it's all been sorted out now. There was a bit of a kerfuffle with it all, but it's all fine now. And that's it. He disappeared and he goes. Haraldsson was fascinated by this because 3 or 4 days later, the steamer comes over from Copenhagen and there's the newspapers. The newspapers are describing the literal report of a fire in Königstrasse at the exact location that the entity, whatever the drop-in said, was taking place. Now, there was no possibility that anybody could have known this information, but there were many witnesses to this. But then what was fascinating was that Elder Haraldsson took himself off and did some research on this and went and did some research in Copenhagen about the character in question. And they discovered there was a man by the name of Larson, or whatever the name was, I think it's Larson, who lived in that street and lived opposite where the fire was. So here we have, and he died around about that time. So here we have a communication from something that had knowledge that nobody could have possibly had about an event that was taking place at the same time in a different location on the planet. Now, this to me says, well, what are these entities? Was it really this person? Was it that Indrida Indridason had some form of precognition and therefore knew the future and therefore was aware of this event and knowing about it in a few days' time? Now, again, I'm interested, Malcolm and Alan, in your interpretation of this and whether you've actually come across any similar cases to this where you've had drop-ins come in or where you've been hypnotizing somebody and you've got another entity come in. I'll come up with Malcolm first and then maybe over to Alan.
Well, first and foremost, what a wonderful story that is. That's incredible. And I dare say, just the way you've told it and the evidence portrayed, because it was back in the day, we never got instantaneous messages as we do now. So that backs up that story. Incredible. I've never heard that one. It's really amazing. The only thing I could say, a little bit similar to a degree, is when I lived in London, there was a very elderly lady. She was in her 90s. She came to one of my talks and she proceeded to tell me a very bizarre tale, similar on the lines. And basically what happened was, it was during the war and it was 1941, 42. And her son was with the British Navy and he was fighting the U-boat menace in the North Atlantic. So he's away in the North Atlantic on his ship and she's back in Tottenham in North London in 17. in her house, and she was knitting. This is the story she said. She was knitting, and then suddenly this instantaneous television screen just appeared about several feet in front of her there. And in this television screen, for want of a better word, was an ocean with two arms flailing about in the ocean. And then she heard this, Mum, it was her son. She was physically looking, this is 1941, she was looking at a vision of her son flailing in the ocean. And it was his thoughts traversing over all these miles to her house in North London. And then suddenly he just sank beneath the waves. Now, what happened there, several weeks later, she got a telegram, again, pre-digital, no emails, telegram, telling her at that same time, sadly, her son's ship was torpedoed by a German U-boat and he lost his life. So in a roundabout way, it's something similar. You know, she was seeing a thing happening at the very, very same time and not getting confirmation to a few weeks later from the Admiralty by this telegram. Crazy.
But isn't it fascinating that she doesn't hear the voice, she sees like a television screen in front of her.
Yeah.
You know, that's extraordinary, isn't it? You know, she wouldn't have made that up. It's because it's so bizarre. She could have turned around and said, I had a vision of my son. Or
Exactly,
something,
yes.
but not. I mean, Alan, have you got
energy, frequency, vibration, and wherever the communication channel is, she was susceptible enough at that time to pick up on that frequency, and that's what she picked up on. You know, that there's a lot to look into this, Nikola Tesla, etc., etc. But
yes.
Just one thing I wanted to put in the mix as well is the common denominator in alien abductions and alien communication is telepathy. Nobody, I don't know any story where people have said, oh, in different languages, oh, hi, you're coming with us. It's all done through a telepathic wavelength. So that's interesting in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, have you got any ideas or anything to add on this?
Well, I was just looking up that factory fire in Denmark story. That was very Copenhagen, very interesting and unusual account. Mike did ask why you think these things happen in the first place. Like, why do you think we are getting these communications? Do you think there's some purpose that these entities might have in trying to reach us?
Malcolm?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. If if that was the case, why isn't everybody getting this information? Why is everybody not getting this communication? I think for me personally, and I could be wrong, I think the more psychically attuned an individual is, the more aware they will be to pick up any sensory kind of spirit communication. I mean, you could have 5 people in a haunted room and only 2 people will see a spirit, and the other 3 will go, wow, I can't see anything. And it's like these old radios, you know, you're turning from radio 1 to radio 2, you're going between frequencies. So I certainly believe, and again, it's just
I agree with that, Malcolm. Absolutely agree with that.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, I do think that most people, if not all people, have a certain amount of, it's just that they're not developed. They haven't developed it and they haven't opened up to it. And I think most people, whether you're trying to channel something in, whether you're trying to manifest something, I think it is. Have you noticed it's all done during the relaxing state of the brain, when the brain's relaxed, or when you are in bed, in the state of mind you go into in the transition between awake and asleep, the dream. Sarah there with the dream states. A lot of stuff happens during that time when we are in our downtime, when we are really relaxed. That's when I believe that there's more chance of you making a connection, having an experience, whether it's ghostly or otherworldly.
Well, this is one of the arguments I use in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, where I argue that the hypnagogic states and the hypnopompic states are where the doors of perception are slightly more open. And it is intriguing to note, and it is important to note, that when we talk about, for instance, sleep paralysis tends to take place in the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states. And it seems to be that's when we perceive something more, whether we call it vibrationary states, whether we call it how the brain functions in terms of attunement. is intriguing. Now, Sarah, it's interesting to bring you in here because, you know, as somebody who is a very intense dreamer in the things that you do you find that when you go into these kind of liminal states that you pick up extra information from somewhere else?
For me, those states, especially the hypnagogic state, is a state where I can recognize my imagination creating and manifesting things. And with regards to sleep paralysis, which you brought up before, Alan, I do work with sleep hypnosis as well. And I think that also that state of being paralyzed and only moving your eyeballs is quite similar to a deep hypnosis as well, where you can't really move and you're in that kind of paralyzed state. I think, you know, what I experience in hypnagogia is the slightest bit of information or sensory input, sound, becomes amplified somehow, and that ideas or words become materialized, and then I will end up in a dream proper, and all of the things that I've thought of have become like material items in the dream environment. I think that definitely we are more sensitive to sensory input, whatever that may be. But I think with sleep paralysis, what often happens is that while someone's in that hypnagogic state and they are deeply relaxed and their body is already in the sort of first stages of that paralysis that occurs when you start to sleep properly, is there'll be something a little bit worrying in the background or the environment for the person. And the more attention and focus they give that scary thing, the more power and material energy it has, so that eventually it feels like it's oppressing you, and people will even describe feeling like something's compressing their chest and things like this. But I've found from hypnagogia is that you know, and especially when you have nightmares and there's something really scary, the more afraid of it that you are, the more power it has over you and the more it can overwhelm you. So I mean, it's difficult because I think like Steve was saying in our last conversation, there are so many variations on these kind of exceptional human experiences that to categorize them in lots of different types of, giving them all different types of names doesn't necessarily do it much justice. Maybe there is just this extra phenomena or this like spirit dimension. And I think what you were saying, Malcolm and Alan, about how some people are more sensitive to this, is it brought to my mind Rudolf Steiner, who I love, and his books, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, and this idea that you can fine tune your spirit organs, if you like, and they can become your organs of spirit perception, and that if you fine tune yourself to become super aware of subtle energies, then you are essentially almost living in a different dimension yourself, whilst giving all kind of impressions that you're living in the material world. You can be much more sensitive to subtle phenomena. And in that book, he has exercises that you can do, like sitting with a plant that's living and a plant that's dead, to become sensitive to the emanations of life that come from a plant. And you become very sensitive to where there is life or where there is energy or where there is movement. And I think that we live in a really overwhelming, distracting world right now, and we've become desensitized to more subtle phenomena because we're bombarded with quite visceral, visual overstimulation on a daily basis, non-stop, 24 hours a day. And I think that people do hugely underestimate the power that things like watching, binge watching Netflix box sets or whatever, for example, can have on their psyche.
I think it's a very valid point, isn't it, that? Because effectively, you know, when we made the point before that that these things come out of us under certain circumstances, but I'd argue that probably these are things we have lost, and abilities we've lost rather than abilities that are just dormant. You know, I would imagine that our ancestors were far more attuned to the world around us than we normally are. For instance, there is a mutual friend of Sarah and I's called Kaz Coronel, who's also been on this show. And one of the things that Kaz said to me a few months ago really intrigued me, when she said she goes outside and she walks barefoot on grass. And it's something we never do normally, but our ancestors would have done that. So there's kind of the telluric forces that come through when you can actually associate more with the environment around us. We never look
grounding
at
yourself,
the sky, do we?
As in grounding, yeah.
Yeah, we never look at the sky. We never see the stars in the same way. I probably, spending one night as you did, Alan, in the depths of Rendlesham Forest there in the middle of the winter, there's a whole different feeling and sensation of the whole thing. And again, just very quickly, I think there is something very peculiar about that part of Suffolk. There is some kind of deep, visceral history within the landscape. And I'll give an example of just how strange that can be. Many, many years ago, I was invited, I probably told this tale before, but myself and my ex-wife were invited to a dinner party at one of the directors of my then company. And Jenny and I were driving around the countryside up from Colchester, and we drove into Suffolk. And Suffolk, we got completely lost. Once you get into Suffolk, there's so many tiny villages and so many little roads and everything else. And we got completely lost. And we were driving round for what seemed like hours. We didn't have a road map with us, which was stupid. You didn't have sat-nav or anything. And we got completely lost. So we drove around, and then suddenly I said to her, "Oh, stop the car. Just stop it here. And I'll find a house and we'll knock on the door and I'll get directions." So we stopped a random place. I walked down the drive, knocked on the door. The guy that had invited me to the party answered the door and said, "Oh, you've arrived. You're a bit early."
No.
Back to the car to say, the house I just picked at random is where the person whose event it is.
Have you done the lottery this week, Tony?
Pardon?
Done the lottery this week?
Yeah, probably. Because your brain just goes, what? How was that? And we all have those kind of experiences, don't we? Where the universe just seems to go, "I'm pulling you." I just want to give you a little clue that there's more to this.
I mean, what fascinates me as well, undoubtedly, is out-of-body experiences and astral projection, etc. And I always try to do a test with anybody that claims to do astral projection. And what that is I have a series of numbers and letters that I'll put out on my bedroom floor, quite big, maybe about that size, letters of the alphabet, numbers. And if they can astral project to come to my home and tell me what these numbers are, and as yet, nobody's been successful. But that's not to say that it doesn't happen, because we've learned so many people are fantastic at doing this, the books of Robert Monroe, etc. So there's something there, but I think that's a study that for me personally, I'd like to get involved with during 2022. I may make that a focus of my research, because it's been an avenue, it's been sitting in the background and it needs to come to the foreground. And but it's
a little bit like remote viewing.
Yes.
Very similar. And Tony and I actually share a friend on Merseyside who's a serving police officer. I think you know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think he's just taken retirement actually.
Just retired.
From his police service. But he has astral projected himself. He told me this many, many years ago that he went into his colleague's bedroom and noted the book that he was reading and the page he was up to. And the next day when he went into the police station, told him what page he was in his book. And it literally knocked the police officer for 6. You've been in my room, you pervert.
You could probably get done for that these days.
But this is the case, isn't it? And I think it's an important experiment to do, because in my book, The Out-of-Body Experience, I discuss this in great detail, and my argument is that I call it the intrasomatic experience, because it seems that we internally model a model of external reality, which we then travel in, and we populate that with our expectations of what the place should be like. But that doesn't explain sometimes when people bring salient information back from out-of-body experiences. And to me, this is evidence of the fact that it is real and it does happen. And again, I'll cite a case, you mentioned Robert Monroe. And Robert Monroe did a series of experiments with Charles Tart way back in the time. And Charles Tart said to Bob Monroe, "I'm moving house to California from Chicago, I think it was." And he said, "You've not been to my new house. See if you can visit the house and have a look around and tell me." And a few days later, Tart gets a phone call from Monroe, and Monroe says, "I managed to get to your house yesterday." And Monroe described in great detail his house, But there were other things he got completely wrong. Like he got
Yeah,
the colour of the furniture or the carpets or the
yeah,
curtain. So to me, this seems to be a kind of an overlay.
yeah,
Somehow there's
yeah.
something much more interesting going on here than just literally a transposition of your psychic energy to go somewhere else. It's telling us far more, I think. But what it's telling us, I'm intrigued and I don't know.
Do you think we'll ever get answers to these enigmas, Tony? I mean, is it something that many of us all over the world have got our own take on these different mysteries, but are we getting any closer? Do you think science will catch up? I mean, I was speaking to a colleague the other day there. He says, Malcolm, wouldn't it be great if you had some form of device that could go into your head and record your dreams, record your dream world? And that's not that as silly as it sounds, because maybe someday in the future, somebody may have a device and it'll bring pictorially all these images. And what would that tell us if that happened? But that's speculation.
Well, I think
There
the
is a
thing
kind
is,
of dream. There is a kind of dream recording device, although it doesn't record from your mind. It records your brainwave patterns to show like vague versions of what the kind of thing that you are dreaming. But what that does do, I can't remember the name of the researcher, but it's a Japanese sleep lab team, and they have hooked people up to really detailed EEG readings. So they show them hours and hours and hours of YouTube footage, and then they put that same EEG device on when they're asleep, and so they're able to see what kinds of forms that people were dreaming about. And so these you can't actually see them on YouTube at the moment because I've searched recently, but the speed and the kind of morphing of the dream forms is really interesting, and it does give you an impression of a dream type of experience, but there's not very much clarity of it. I'm like personally very interested in that as well, because you know, my interest in lucid dreams, I've had lucid dreams since I was little, and my fantasy was always to invent a machine that could record my dreams, so it would save me a lot of bother, because I also wanted to be a film director and I could just hook people up for that.
So when you wake up in the morning, Sarah, you can't wait for the night to go back to sleep.
Well, I don't know about last night. We're talking about sensory input becoming like amplified. This morning, just before I woke up, I had a dream that I was in Northampton, taking part in this street procession, like this New Orleans style street procession, and people were serving grilled alligator, and I was walking around Northampton going, it was like incredible, amazing place. And then I realized when I woke up that the street procession or the drumming sound was actually the bin men outside my flat.
Yes, yeah.
extraordinary.
But I think also equally that it's interesting when people claim to meet their deceased relatives in dreams, and you say to yourself, it can only be maybe one or two things. Either it's just a dream and it's just fanciful imagery intertwining with the dream world, or could it be? We don't know. Could it be that truly our deceased relatives are there and communicating with us? You know, but I don't know. It's a tricky one.
I think the same phenomena can have a variety of different causes and reasons. Like you were talking about out of body experiences and astral projections, and I think that a lot of the astral projection accounts, I think, often are people in a lucid dream that have created a sort of facsimile of that environment. Because once you get to the boundary of what they know, it all kind of falls apart when they open a door or they go through a mirror or something like this. But then similarly, I think that my personal idea about near-death experiences is that we do have this spirit component, and if the material body is sufficiently threatened, our spirit, our essence will try to escape just because it doesn't want to experience the trauma. And I think in a lot of NDE accounts, and even things like false awakenings, there seems to be a much more objective out-of-body experience. So I think that, you know, and even within my own field of lucid dreaming, when people come to workshops and you talk about lucid dreaming, people have very slight, you know, or sometimes massive differences in their interpretation of what a lucid dream even is. So I think the kind of more names and terms we give everything, perhaps the more unnecessarily complicated it all gets.
Your point there about nomenclature is very important. You know, we need to be very, very precise in the terminology we use. So we're all talking about the same thing, you know, and of course academics will argue this all the time. This is why they have this obscure way of describing things, because it's very precise in the way it describes the circumstances. Now, I've argued, and Sarah and I have discussed this many, many times, and we believe now with the amount of information that's now being pulled together on these shows and the other shows we do, is that, you know, we're building something really quite significant here and quite important. And every time we get a new guest, I always feel each guest brings their own little bit of the jigsaw puzzle. I don't know if you agree with this, Sarah. And I feel they come along and then
you don't necessarily think that the talks are related when they're being booked, but then weirdly they'll all lead on from one another, won't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's as if we planned it, and if we haven't, you know, there's this, you know, it's when people are available that we bring them in, and maybe it's because Sarah and I, it's in our minds what we've just talked about, and therefore it's something we're going to bring up. But we genuinely believe that we're creating something here of powerful significance and importance, and this is the feedback we're getting from people, and saying that, you know, what we're doing now is important. And I think it is. Right, we're now getting towards the end of the 2 hours. Finally, I'd like to just thank you, all of you, for being involved in this. But Malcolm, if you can tell us a little bit about how people can get in touch with you, what your work is, what projects you're working on at the moment, your website, and everything else. So if you can just give us a little bit so the guys can contact you and follow up on your work.
Yeah, for sure. People can contact me via email. And it's Malky, that's MALCKYSPI @yahoo.com. I'm the author of, at the moment, 9 books on ghosts, poltergeists, UFOs, Nessie. I've been down in the submarine in Loch Ness, but that's another discussion. All these books can be found on Amazon. So if anybody wants to type in my name, Malcolm Robinson, Amazon, you'll see some of the paranormal UFO books there. Don't have a website, just a Facebook page, and people can join my Facebook page there as well. Just search for Malcolm Robinson and you'll find me on there. But at the end of the day, I'd just like to thank your good self, Tony, Alan and Sarah, wonderful, wonderful people. Many thanks for having me on your show, because this is what people need to, they need to learn more about these subjects, and don't believe a word of any of it. Make up your own minds, do your own research, and there'll be a wee light bulb moment will happen when that feels right to you.
You know, you almost said exactly what Trisha Robertson said recently when we had Trisha on. Very, very similar worldview as well, and I think it's important. Alan, can you just tell the guys a little bit about where they can contact you and your work as well, because your work is fascinating.
Yes. Basically just Google Alan Bates and there's a wealth of information out there. I do have a website on hypnosis. I have a clinical hypnotherapy website, my practice in Europe, in Malta. And I also have a dedicated site to past life regression, where you can actually download and listen to audios of about 20 cases of past lives. That's quite interesting as well. My books are also available on Amazon, the same as Malcolm's. This is my latest one, UFOs, It's Time to Wake Up, by Alien Appointment. And it was by royal appointment, because I've performed and worked for royal families around the world before. So the book was originally by royal appointment. And then a Maltese friend said to me, well, why don't you call it Alien Appointment? Because you did actually speak with an alien with an appointment with Nick Pope in the Rendlesham Forest case. So it's changed from by royal appointments to by alien appointments. But so that's where they can contact me. But to answer Malcolm's question that he put for us before about where this is going and are we going to find the answers, Malcolm, I think the way the world is progressing now, and with the tools that we have, I really do think it's only a matter of time for disclosure. And that's where I'm praying it's going to happen in my lifetime, that we will get disclosure. And on a different note, I think science is going to answer a hell of a lot of these questions that we all have. No one's always going to, they say seeing is believing. And I totally respect that. And don't, on a finishing point, don't forget, guys, that 400 years ago, we would have a lynch mob waiting outside to take us. we burned at the stake, a lot of us, 400 years ago. So look how far we've come.
Absolutely. And Sarah, just as the developing Sarah Janes fan club on this INCON and everything else as well. People regularly contact me and say, how can I learn more about Sarah's work and what she's doing? Just take the opportunity now, because I know that some of the work you're doing is extraordinary, and your own podcast that you do as well. So here's the opportunity just to tell guys about that as well.
On my website is the mysteries.org. And I run, as you know, a lecture club that has kind of turned into being all about Egyptology and ancient culture, because I do think, for me personally, a lot of the new discoveries are really old discoveries that are being repackaged. And actually, I love going back to the ancient stuff, because I think that you're going to the source material, really, because part of my belief is that people in ancient times had different ideas about reality, and perhaps those ideas about reality were formed because they had a more entangled relationship with nature and they felt more part of the world. So I have my Egyptology YouTube series up on YouTube, and I also am running a course about the history and culture of sleep medicine and dream therapy, starting on the 17th of December. And I think that's about it. But yeah, everything that I do is on my website, themysteries.org.
And of course, the anticipation of your new book as well.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Looking forward to. Absolutely. Right, guys, really great to have you involved on the show, and we're looking forward to next week when we've got another 2 shows. We've got the Consciousness Hour on Sunday, and the guest there will be Daniel Pinchbeck, who is a very hugely famous American writer. And that's going to be a really interesting show. And Daniel has some very interesting ideas and thoughts. The last time I saw Daniel, he was giving a talk with Russell Brand at Breaking Convention. I think, Sarah, was that the one we both went to, I think? Or was that the one before?
I'm not sure if I went to the Russell Brand one. I'm usually just outside the whole time at Breaking Convention. And
the last Breaking Convention we went, I don't think we went to many lectures, did we? I think we all went outside talking, which is one of these things. And then on Monday, we've got a show similar to this one again, where we've got another returning guest in Dr. Steve Taylor. And Steve, again, as a philosopher, is somebody who's very, very interesting guy. And again, there was a lot of demand to get Steve back, purely and simply because we just scratched the surface on what he's involved in as well. And of course, Steve was one of the prize winners on the Bigelow Prize as well. So we've got one of the Bigelow Prize winners involved as well, which is really wonderful. We'll chat to him about that as well. So everybody, thanks everybody for listening in and spending a couple of hours with us. And remember, without you, this show wouldn't work. We need you being listening in and everything else as well. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Happy Christmas.
Yeah, happy Christmas. Yeah, absolutely. See you.
See you.